Hi. I wanted to have a family tree, kind of a place where we could gather all of our properties of our quadrilaterals that we've done so far. So it's all in one spot instead of kind of having to look through our notes to find everything. So we're going to fill this sheet out today. We're actually going to fill out this middle bit. We're going to save this sheet and we're going to fill these out when we talk about trapezoids a little bit later. All right, so this sheet just has, if you look at it, it's got a line for the definition. So what makes a quadrilateral a quadrilateral? What makes a parallelogram? What's the definition of a parallelogram? And then any bullet point underneath it is just extra properties that it has. So let's start at the very top. What's the definition of a quadrilateral? What makes it a quadrilateral? It is a four-sided polygon. So anything that has four sides, as long as it's a polygon, will be determined as a quadrilateral. All right, so let's move on to parallelograms. Do you remember which one of those properties was the definition of the parallelogram? The definition is it's going to have two pairs of parallel sides. I don't have a lot of room, so I'm going to abbreviate when I can. So this is the abbreviation for parallel. All right, so once we know it's a parallelogram, so its opposite sides would be parallel, right? If we marked it in our picture, there were four other properties that were true. One more about sides, two about angles, and one about diagonals. So take a minute, pause it, see what you remember, and then we'll go through them together. So not only are opposite sides parallel, opposite sides are congruent. So that's the two about sides. Now we have two about angles. The opposite angles are congruent. Opposite angles are congruent. So this is the angle symbol, and that's the congruent symbol, same one I used there. So opposite angles are congruent. The consecutive interior angles are supplementary, which means they're going to add up to 180 degrees. Consecutive interior angles are supplementary, and if you want to put that 180 in there to remind yourself, please do it. Okay, the last one was about the diagonals. The diagonals bisect each other. Which means they cut each other in half, right? Cut in half. So if we were to draw them in, I'll just draw one over here. Oh, that's a terrible parallelogram. The diagonals would cut each other in half. All right, so a parallelogram is underneath quadrilateral, which means it has to be a four-sided polygon, right? So quadrilateral could be a parallelogram. But a parallelogram also splits into two pieces, or two different shapes. So let's talk about the rectangle first. So because a rectangle is underneath the parallelogram, all of these properties go down to the rectangle. So a rectangle has two pairs of opposite sides, congruent opposite angles, consecutive angles are supplementary, and the diagonals bisect each other. All of that is true about the rectangle, but there are two things that separate it from a parallelogram. The definition is about the angles. It's going to have four right angles. So they're going to be 90 degrees in every corner. So that is the definition. That's what makes the rectangle and makes it different from the parallelogram. And then it has one bonus property about the diagonals. Not only do they bisect each other because it's a parallelogram, but they're also congruent. So it has four right angles and congruent diagonals. So a parallelogram could just be a regular parallelogram shape. Sometimes it could be a rectangle and have four right angles. Sometimes it could be a rhombus, which means, and rhombus and parallelograms look very similar. So really the definition difference is it has four congruent, terrible congruent symbol, four congruent sides. So all of the sides will be the same length. in a parallelogram, sometimes the top and the bottom are a little bit longer, sometimes the left and the right are a little bit longer, but in a rhombus, all of those sides are congruent. So that's the definition. That's what sets it apart. And then there are two bonus properties. They're both about the diagonals. So when we draw these diagonals in, not only do they bisect each other, they are also perpendicular. So this is the symbol for perpendicular, which means they make right angles, perpendicular diagonals. Now, the diagonals of a rhombus are not congruent because a rhombus is not a rectangle, but it does have perpendicular diagonals. Same with the other way. A rectangle does not have perpendicular diagonals because a rectangle is not a rhombus. The other thing that the diagonals do is to the angles. You might remember the diagonals bisect the opposite angles. So when I draw this diagonal in, it cuts that in half. So diagonals bisect opposite angles. So it cuts those angles in half. Now, the last shape that we have here is a square. You can see that a square is underneath rectangle and underneath rhombus, which means a square has all of the rectangle properties. So it will have 4 right angles and congruent diagonals, but it'll also have the rhombus properties, 4 congruent sides, perpendicular diagonals, and opposite angles bisected by the diagonals. But a square is also underneath a parallelogram, which means it's always a parallelogram too, so it has all of those properties as well. And it's a quadrilateral because it's underneath quadrilateral. So a square is always a rectangle, it's always a rhombus, it's always a parallelogram. Oh, I can't see everything. And it's always a quadrilateral. So then what's the definition of a square? You can see there's no extra bullet points. So a square doesn't have any properties of its own. It just inherits all of these properties. So the definition of a square is it's a regular quadrilateral. Now, do you remember what regular means from like the first day of summer school? Regular means it has 4 congruent angles and 4 congruent sides. 4 congruent angles comes from the rectangle, and 4 congruent sides comes from the rhombus. So, in a couple days, we are going to fill this side out for trapezoids and for trapezoids and isosceles trapezoids. So don't lose the sheet or don't lose the notes wherever you wrote it down. And make sure you have this handy because when we take the test on this in a few days, you get to use this. It's an open note test. So if you have this handy, it'll be awesome to use. All right, if you have any questions, please reach out and let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.